we experience many transitions throughout our lives. Most of us transition from hospital to home, from home to school, from school to adult roles, then into retirement. Parents and guardians often dictate the transitions in our young lives until the transition from high school, which can be an overwhelming experience for many students, especially students with disabilities. This transition period can last several years after a student leaves high school, and some students may flounder for their entire lives. I remember flipping through the course catalog thinking, I wish someone would just tell me what I'm supposed to do with my life. And yes, it was a book back then. Researchers, parents, and educators have reported dismal post-school outcomes for students with disabilities to policymakers with hopes of finding a solution since the 1960s. To understand where we are going in the field of transition, we must first understand where we have been. In 1992, Andrew Halpern reviewed the previous 25 years of transition education and programs and described them as old wine in new bottles. As much as I appreciate a good wine reference, this was not exactly meant as a compliment. He felt the so-called new transition models of the early 90s were simply variations of the tried and true transition models of the past. Halpern wanted to warn the up-and-comers against discarding research of the past while searching for a silver bullet that would allow all students with disabilities to live happily ever after with equal wages and benefits. Halpern's 1992 well-referenced article is one example of how leaders in the field of special education have influenced the views of policymakers to ensure students with disabilities leave high school with every opportunity to succeed in their chosen life paths. Before educators were required to write IEPs for students with disabilities, the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973 required rehabilitation service providers to write an Individualized Written Rehabilitation Plan, IWRP, for individuals with disabilities. This plan included long-term rehabilitation goals, types of services vocational rehabilitation would provide, and rehabilitation evaluations. The Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was not restricted to employment-only mandates. The Act also stressed the importance of community life and daily living skills for individuals with disabilities. Congress enacted the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, Public Law 94-142 in 1975 to protect the rights of and improve services for individuals with disabilities. This landmark law is currently enacted as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA 2004. Transition education, as we know it in the field of special education, is relatively new. For some of you, the 90s may seem like ancient history. For those of us who actually rocked a Rachel haircut, the 90s seem like just 10 years ago. Policymakers used seminal transition models and previous rehabilitation legislation for the basis of the first transition amendment to IDEA in 1990, which required educators to address transition services by including coordinating activities for all students with disabilities by the age of 16. Researchers and educators continued to manipulate the definition of transition to reflect all areas of need for a successful transition to life after high school for students with disabilities. The Council for Exceptional Children's Division on Career Development and Transition supported a definition of transition in a position paper in 1994 describing transition as a change in status from behaving primarily as a student to assuming emergent adult roles in the community. These roles include employment, participating in post-secondary education, maintaining a home, becoming appropriately involved in the community, and experiencing satisfactory participation in receiving adult agency services and natural supports within the community.